Thank you. Let me just make sure I've got the right talk here. Yeah, I do. Well, this is quite a marathon, isn't it? Are we all holding up? Thank you. Thank you. I feel really great about the energy in this room. Thank you. Thank you. So, Magicians of the Gods is the working title that I'm giving to the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. Fingerprints of the Gods was published in 1995 and was focused work for me from 1992 through until its publication in 1995. I was innocent in those days. I had no idea what I was bringing down on my head. As a matter of fact, I did not expect the book to be successful. I had no expectations of it whatsoever, nor did my publishers. But it caught a nerve around the world, and it really annoyed archaeologists. My great crime, it seemed, was to write a book that was successful. Had the book flopped, I wouldn't have annoyed them, but it led to questions being asked. And they also felt, why is he selling lots of books when we aren't? And it led to this antagonism, and I had no idea what kind of storm I was about to bring down on my head, or how much focused negative attention I would be subjected to. And I can honestly say I wasn't prepared for it. But gradually I learnt the way. In those days we didn't really have the internet. It was coming in, but mainstream authorities could dominate and control public opinion through the mainstream media in a way that's much harder to do today. In fact, the mainstream media are rapidly making themselves completely irrelevant, I would say. What has happened since 1995 is that there has been a gradual accumulation of new evidence. And that new evidence has reached the point where I feel there's a whole new book to write. And I am going to share some of my work on that book. But again, I am also going to go over some of the work that I've done in the past, because this is an integrated thing. When I come to write the book, I'll simply refer readers to Fingerprints of the Gods. But in this talk, I need to go over some of the material that I went over in Fingerprints and share some of the new material, and I hope to put it into an integrated whole. Yes, again, I want to pay tribute to my wife. Santa, who has saved my life in so many ways, and shared every adventure with me, whether it's adventures in the Amazon jungle, or adventures under the ocean, or adventures at the top of the Great Pyramid. We've had an amazing 22 years together. So took all the photographs that we'll be seeing here, and I would never have written a single word if it hadn't been for her. The great privilege of my relationship with this amazing woman. So, let's start with pyramids. In 1995, there was a general, the general argument of academia was that there couldn't be any relationship between the pyramids of the old world, like the pyramids of Egypt, and the pyramids of the new world, the pyramids of Mexico or South America. There couldn't be any relationship because the pyramids were from completely different periods. Like Teotihuacan archaeologically looks about 2,000 years old, somewhat less in some places, and Giza at least 4,500 years old. So how could there be a connection between these two places? Just accident that people build pyramids all over the it's often pointed out that that's the easiest way to make a high structure, is to build a pyramid, although actually building an accurate pyramid is a very difficult thing to do. Even though there seem to be ideological similarities between these sites. I mean, Teotihuacan means the place where men became gods. And Giza, as I showed earlier, is a place that was thought capable of transforming men into gods, and that both were the beginnings of in a sense, of a new age of the world. And there's 3 big pyramids at Teotihuacan and 3 at Giza as well, laid out in roughly the same pattern. But this is all supposedly a coincidence, even though veneration of a kind of star cult is present in both places. Even though, if you take the pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, you get this amazing effect on the spring equinox when you see this serpent's head at the bottom here, and just at about 5:20 in the evening on the spring and autumn equinox, the serpent's body forms with shadow on the edge of the pyramid here, because the pyramid is so perfectly aligned to the sun's position in the sky that it casts that shadow only at that time of the year and never anywhere else. Just so at the equinox at Giza, the pyramids are perfectly aligned, in their case north, south, east and west, and you get this perfect shadow running due west at dawn on the equinox at Giza. So in both places the pyramids are being used to create a marriage between sky and ground. But this must all be coincidental, because the pyramid of Kukulkan is 1,000 years old and the pyramid of Giza is 4,500 years old. Until was discovered in Peru a site called Grahamn in the 1990s, after Fingerprints of the Gods was published, where there is a huge pyramid complex over a very extensive area, and also at nearby Banduria, enormous pyramids. And lo and behold, these pyramids are accepted now by archaeologists as being the same age as the pyramids of Giza, more than 2,500 years old. So the argument that there could be no connection because the pyramids of the New World are much more recent than the pyramids of the Old World has been destroyed by new archaeological discoveries. I'm telling this story because I think that's the first thing that I would like to see archaeologists do, is to have a little more humility and to recognize that the next turn of the spade can actually rewrite history and change the whole perspective on things. So there's my book, Fingerprints of the Gods, a well-thumbed copy. And the central message of the book is that civilization is older and much more mysterious than we thought. And I was enormously attacked by academics and their friends in the media in the mid to late 1990s for that message. They had got civilization taped. There was no way it was older and more mysterious than we thought. And one of the magazines that particularly attacked me on behalf of the academic lobby was an British magazine called New Scientist. So I have to confess to a slight warm glow when, in 2013, New Scientist's front cover said, civilization is older and And in this talk, amongst other things, I'll be explaining why they're now confessing that. Just put these figures in your head for a moment and set them aside in parentheses until a little later in the talk. There's the sun. These are round numbers, of course, and the images are certainly not to scale. The sun has a diameter of 864,000 miles, in round numbers. The Earth has a diameter of 8,000 miles, and the Moon has a diameter of 2,160 miles. Another thought to plant: we don't know exactly the origin of the British mile. It is an ancient measuring system. Its origins are lost in the mists of time. 864,000 divided by 2,160 equals 400. In other words, the diameter of the sun is 400 times greater than the diameter of the moon. That's why we get eclipses. That's why we can have eclipse. The moon is a much smaller body, but it's 400 times nearer. It's 400, not only 400 times smaller, but 400 times nearer. And the moon will perfectly eclipse the sun. Consider the likelihood of that happening. You know, a few 100,000 miles further out, wouldn't be happening. Smaller or larger, it wouldn't be happening. Perfect eclipse. And 864,000 divided by 8,000 equals 108. 108, 2,160, just keep those figures in mind. There's our beautiful Earth. And there's the Earth during the Ice Age, when ice sheets 2 miles deep covered North America, large parts of the Andes, and also covered Northern Europe. Where did all that water come from that was frozen into the ice sheets? Why, it came out of the oceans, of course. That's why the world today, that all those ice sheets have melted, looks a bit different from the world during the Ice Age. Because those 2 mile thick ice caps resulted in a 400-foot lowering of sea level during the Ice Age, with the result that there was no, for example, no Red Sea, there was no Persian Gulf, Sri Lanka was joined to South India, Indonesia and Malaysia, the Philippines, which is a huge, gigantic continent during the Ice Age, that now look very, very different today. Australia, where we are now, much bigger place, was joined to New Guinea. First glance, it doesn't seem so different, but actually there were a lot of differences in the world during the Ice Age. And 10 million square miles of land, that's roughly the size of Europe and China added together, that were above water then are underwater now. So we can't do archaeology without taking account of those lost land masses that have been lost in the last 12,000 years. Now here's the kind of conventional, I've taken these timelines from the internet. I don't completely agree with all of them, but it's a conventional view of the story of civilization. That the old Stone Age, about 2 million years ago, first stone tools were in fact about 2.5 million years ago. I don't agree with that. First evidence of Paleolithic religious beliefs can be pushed back a lot earlier than 28,000 years, but I'm giving you the broad time span. The Ice Age, the last glacial maximum is 21,000 years ago. That's when the ice sheets reached their maximum extent. And by about 10,000 years ago, they were all gone. They were all gone. So over a period of 11,000 years, those 2 mile deep ice caps melted. And then, the new Stone Age, the agricultural revolution, and the first civilizations kick in supposedly about 3,300 BC, Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, a little bit later, ancient India, come through to China, the Greeks, and so on. This is the standard timeline of human civilization. So civilization is a product of the last 5,000 and a bit years. That's the general view, this clustering into big cities and what we would call civilization. And if we take some of those sites of civilization, like Sumer, for example, the ziggurat of Ur is a sort of classic example of Sumerian civilization. They built a lot in mud brick. It was a very highly advanced culture in many, many ways. And its origins certainly go back earlier than 3,300 BC. You can trace it back further than that, but that's when the big cities start to be built. And interestingly, Santa and I, on our way here, just stopped off in the United Arab Emirates because a friend of ours said that there were some ancient ruins there, and we thought we'd go have a look at them. And lo and behold, it turns out there's these amazing megalithic structures in the Emirates near a place called Al Ain. And this kind of cyclopean masonry, which is more commonly found in the Andes, is very much present there. And these are thought to date back about 5,000 years. They found burials in them that can be dated to 5,000 years ago, but that only means that they were there 5,000 years ago. They may have been reused as tombs at that point. And the United Arab Emirates is a little bit down the Gulf from the site of ancient Sumer, but broadly speaking, the same cultural area. Now, in Sumer, they had a flood story. And they traced the origins of civilization in some way to flood, cast back into the distant past. They spoke of a being called Oannes, who was he's shown, wearing a fish on his head. He's a sort of combination of fish and man. He has survived the flood. He has swum through the waters of the flood, and he emerges from into the post-flood world, and he teaches civilization to mankind. And it's interesting that the Persian Gulf, as it looks today, was a very different place during the Ice Age. It was a kind of Garden of Eden, actually, with the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, joining into a gigantic stream that ran through the middle of it and emerged in the Straits of Hormuz. And it was rapidly flooded about 12,000 years ago. And our Western, the one we're familiar with in Western culture, the flood of Noah, is solidly founded upon the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Sumerian flood story that tells of Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah. So there's a flood tradition back of Sumerian culture. If you go to Egypt, go to Giza, many archaeologists will tell you that there is no flood tradition in Egypt. I don't know how they dare to say that. Complete nonsense. Because there is a whole massive flood story told on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu. And that flood story is really interesting because in the so-called Edfu building texts, which are inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Edfu, we hear that the story was originally written on animal skins, but that those animal skins had become so fragile that it seemed that they were copied many times from one animal skin to another, but eventually they had reached a point where they were so fragile that they decided to make a permanent record of them. And they built the Temple of Horus at Edfu to inscribe that story on its walls. And the whole walls of the temple are covered with these amazing Edfu building texts. And they absolutely do speak of a flood. They speak of the homeland of the primeval ones, an island place that was destroyed in a great flood. And they tell how the primeval ones, the gods, came to Egypt and established religion by building what they call primeval mounds up and down the land. And the suggestion is the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which stands on top of a natural mound, was one of those primeval mounds. In other words, that every temple and pyramid in Egypt stands atop a more ancient site that goes back to the first time, to primeval time, when the gods came to Egypt. So, of course, we've all heard the story of Atlantis, which has its origins. The earliest surviving version of the story of Atlantis is passed down to us by Plato. And interestingly, he said he got the story from his ancestor Solon, the great lawmaker, who in turn had got it from the ancient Egyptians. Solon went to Egypt and he was shown inscriptions in a temple that no longer exists, the Temple of Sais in the Delta, which told the story of Atlantis, and that Atlantis had perished in a single terrible day and a night, a gigantic flooding and earthquake cataclysm that brought an end to the civilization of Atlantis, and that this had happened 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That's 9,600 BC, 11,600 years before our time. And again, the view of the mainstream is that the Atlantis myth is just that. In many ways, that Plato just made it up to illustrate some political point or other, and that there's no reality to it. But that's really interesting because 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago, is actually a very key date in the story of the meltdown of the Ice Age. As a matter of fact, 11,600 years ago exactly is the end of a mysterious period that geologists call the Younger Dryas. See, the Earth was emerging from the Ice Age between 21,000 years ago through until 12,980 years ago. And then suddenly, and sea levels were rising, and then suddenly it went back into a massive deep freeze. Instant, virtually overnight, temperatures just plummeted. And the Earth became frozen, colder than it was at the coldest points of the Ice Age. And this lasted from 12,980 years to 11,600 years ago, when it equally suddenly stopped. And the melting resumed, and there was gigantic flooding. That's exactly the period, 11,600 years ago, that Plato says occurred the gigantic flooding that brought about the end of Atlantis. Is that a coincidence, or could he have been on to something? At any rate, the whole story of human civilization as it's taught to us supposedly unfolds in this period between 11,600 years ago and today. And before it, we've got this mysterious interval called the Younger Dryas. Anybody looking at the story of the origins of civilization has got to be interested in this punctuation mark and what is going on there in the world. What plunges the world into a sudden deep freeze and brings it out again in that very distinctive period of time. Now, of course, Atlantis was said to be in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere between America and Africa. Of course, on this map from Kircher, south is up, so you have to turn it upside down to see it the way we normally see the map. But that's where Atlantis was thought to be, and there isn't any evidence of a great landmass exactly there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but the frame of reference is very much the Atlantic Ocean. So it's interesting that many other parts of the world have their own type of Atlantis story. If we go to another of those centers of ancient civilization, in ancient India, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are the best-known cities of the so-called Indus Valley civilization. And they had a port at Lothal, which doesn't look very impressive today. It kind of looks like a swimming pool in the desert, actually. But that was this. This was a sheltered harbor that was used for the fleets of the Indus Valley civilization, which traded as far away as Sumer and Egypt. And if you go to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, as Sant and I have done, which requires a military escort these days, you find really very extensive mud brick cities. I mean, it's incredibly dull to look at. It looks like some sort of gigantic modern housing estate. But it's 5,000 years old, and it's brilliantly planned, and they have amazing sewage works and flushing toilets and all amenities. This was a highly civilized place, and these huge baths that they had which were waterproofed with bitumen. And that's Harappa and Dholavira, which are two of the other Indus Valley cities, again dating back to the horizon about 5,000 years ago. Now here's an interesting thing. Found in Harappa and in Mohenjo-Daro are these so-called seals, which were used to impress an impression on wax or clay. And what the seals show is known yoga positions. Here with the feet forward, relatively easy position to do. But here, a much more difficult posture, which is called Mula Bandhasana, where the feet are actually turned back under your butt, so the heels are there and the toes are pointing back. That takes some work to do that position. That's an advanced yoga posture. You don't get to that overnight. What that's telling us is that 5,000 years ago, in the Indus Valley civilization, yoga was already fully evolved as a system of ideas and physical exercises. Yoga, therefore, must be much more ancient than 5,000 years old, if it's already fully evolved 5,000 years ago. But how much more ancient? How far back can we take that story of that spiritual discipline? Then there's the Vedas, the ancient scriptures of India, which academia keeps on insisting are the result of so-called Aryan invaders who entered India relatively recently, less than 2000 BC, really less than 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago or so. But the Vedas contain material within them that suggests they are much older than that. And it may be that the Vedas are the lost scriptures of the Indus Valley civilization. There's actually no evidence for Aryan invaders in India at all. It's a modern archaeological fantasy. And in the story in the Vedas, we find the story of Manu and the 7 rishis. Manu is the Indian Noah, and the 7 rishis are the 7 wise men who are saved from the flood by the god Vishnu in his avatar as a fish. So it's interesting that there's this flood story in northern India, particularly when we look at the whole nature of northern India during the Ice Age and how much more extensive it was than it is today. And up here, in a little town called Dwarka, there's a fully developed local flood myth, which Santa and I went to check out. It took us the best part of a year and a half to get permission from the Indian authorities to actually go diving in Dwarka. But we eventually succeeded. Dwarka is an amazingly beautiful place. It was, in legend, it was the city of Krishna. And at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, it was flooded and went under the waves. So we can see these typing of the city of Krishna and then the flood coming. This is Dwarka as it looks today. And this is the bay in front of Dwarka. And there underwater, indeed, as the legend says, is the remains of a city. Not very deep, and probably not that old. Probably not more than about 5,000 years old, I would guess. Nobody knows. They've never been able to accurately date it. But the myth is true. There is a city underwater off Dwarka, and the whole of ceremony in Dwarka today is devoted to remembrance of that city of Krishna. Up here in the Gulf of Cambay, something else very interesting was found. Now, the Gulf of Cambay was at the center of a huge area of dry land during the Ice Age. And India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, who were doing side-scan sonar surveys in the Gulf of Cambay, which is a highly polluted area, and they were looking to pollution control in the Gulf of Cambay, their side-scan sonar suddenly started returning regularities on the seabed 40 meters below, 130 feet below. And those regularities take the form of 2 gigantic cities with an extent of about 9 kilometers each, which lie along the sides, the banks of ancient riverbeds. They're being cautious. They're saying possible archaeological feature, but it's difficult to imagine what else this is at the bottom of the seabed. No diving has ever been done to follow this up. They did some dredging, and from the dredging they pulled up man-made artifacts from those remains of rectangular buildings on the bottom of the seabed, but for some reason which I cannot understand, no diving has ever been allowed. The Gulf of Cambay is a security-sensitive area. It's very close to Pakistan. There are some issues there. It's a difficult place to dive, but it would be possible with remotely operated vehicles anyway to investigate this much more fully. It's not been done. South India also has its own Atlantis story. And the Atlantis story in South India is set in exactly the same time frame as Plato's Atlantis. It was a submergence that occurred about 11,500 years ago, according to the traditions. And we are told in those traditions that South India once extended much more deeply into the Indian Ocean than it does today. Those traditions are right. South India did extend much more deeply into the Indian Ocean than it does today, because sea level was 400 feet lower. The Maldives were part of that, but were then not tiny little islands, but part of a gigantic landmass. And it's interesting that on the Maldives, they're not very impressive, but you can find pyramids on the Maldives to this day. Tor Heyerdahl did some excavation of those pyramids. And there's a recollection that, here's the statue of the Tamil poet and philosopher Tiruvallur, 1st century BC at Kanyakumari. This links to what is called the Sangam tradition. The Indian traditions of Kumari Kandam say that there were universities, whole schools of learning and study based on this lost land which was flooded, and that some survivors, remnants, came and settled in India and passed on a continuity into mainland India. So Sri Lanka, going to the other side of South India, was joined to the mainland. There is, of course, this intriguing phenomenon called Rama's Bridge, which is remembered in the Ramayana, that a bridge was built between Sri Lanka and India, and it actually shows up in aerial photographs. But the places that we went diving are up here, Pumpahar and Mahabalipuram. And in both of those places, we found underwater ruins at depths which suggest they've been submerged for more than 12,000 years. They're not particularly impressive. They've been underwater for 12,000 years after all. And the water is extremely turbid, basically dirty there. It's like diving in raw sewage. But here is the so-called U-shaped structure at a depth of about 100 feet underwater off Pumpahar, undoubtedly man-made. We went there with India's National Institute of Oceanography, and they don't dispute it. These are man-made blocks on the seabed. And again here at Mahabalipuram, weird connection there. I lived in South India as a child, and my parents used to take me to Mahabalipuram. We lived in a place called Vellore inland. They used to take me to Mahabalipuram. My very first swimming lessons were done in the water there. So it was weird to go back in sort of the year 2000 and go diving there. My wife Santha speaks Tamil as her first language, so we were able to communicate. There's many interesting rock-hewn temples on shore there, but we were able to communicate with local fishermen. And what the local fishermen told us was the legend of the 7 pagodas. They said there's a whole city underwater here off our coasts. And it's bloody annoying, actually, because we keep catching our nets on it. And people have to dive down through the nets, and there's all these buildings down there. And we said, have you told anybody about that? And we said, they said, we tell everyone about it, but nobody believes us. So again, after a lot of bureaucratic hassle, I managed to organize an expedition to Mahabalipuram, in this case with the Scientific Exploration Society in Britain and the cooperation of the National Institute of Oceanography. This was in 2002. And we went diving, and lo and behold, the fishermen's stories were true. Underwater are extensive submerged ruins, and those ruins begin right close to shore in depths of just 5 meters, and continue for 5 or 6 kilometers out to sea, down to depths of 30 plus meters underwater. And again, there's no disputing that they are man-made ruins. There's the top of an ancient wall protruding above the seabed. There's a wall with a standout feature. I'm putting my diving knife into the joint between 2 blocks here. And no doubt about it that it's man-made. But our expedition there caused offense because a major discovery wasn't supposed to be made on the initiative of foreigners. And I'm afraid to say that this is how it was in India at that time. And we weren't allowed to do any more diving, and the whole thing stopped until the Boxing Day tsunami, when the bay in front of Mahabalipuram was emptied out for half an hour, and loads of people saw the ruins underwater there, that had been underwater. Since then, the National Institute of Oceanography has been doing a little bit of research in what is called the intertidal zone, down to depths of just 5 meters. For some reason, it is not going and exploring the stuff out in 30 meters, which is what is really interesting, because at 30 meters depth, it's been underwater for 12,000 years. There's a place called Tiruvannamalai, inland from there, which has a flood tradition. It's said that oceans will not submerge it, even at the time of the Great Deluge. The ground near it is not at all touched by the 4 oceans that become agitated at the close of the Yuga of the World Age, when the annihilation of all living beings takes place. And it talks about how the future seeds are deposited there, and how Brahmins who resort to the foot of this red mountain, Arunachala, are called after the deluge and made to study the Vedas. In other words, the Vedas are antediluvian and are re-promulgated after each pralaya that ends a world age. And this is the temple of Tiruvannamalai that stands at the bottom of that red hill, and indeed ascetics, rishis, to this day are found on that mountain. Let's move over now to this area, Indonesia, which was, as I said, a huge landmass during the Ice Age. Here we have the Indonesian islands and Borneo and so on as we know them today, but during the Ice Age, a continent-sized landmass was above water. And there's some amazing things on Indonesia. This is Suku in central Java. I mean, if you look at that, would you say that's in central Java? I mean, to me, it looks like a Mexican pyramid. It looks pretty much like Chichen Itza, actually. But there it is in central Java. And of particular interest, and I think it's going to rewrite history, is a site about 3 hours' drive from the city of Bandung. I first heard of this site about July or August of 2013, actually in two reports that were published in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age, about the discovery of, or the revelation of, an incredibly ancient archaeological site by an Indonesian geologist called Danny Hilman Natawijaja. He tells us that his middle name is Hillman because his mum and dad took him to the hospital in a Hillman car when he was born. Sweet. Danny is a Caltech-trained geologist. He's a very rigorous scientist, but he's very open-minded. And he was aware of this site called Gunung Padang. Gunung Padang, for people who know the Indonesian language, it sounds like it means mountain field, but actually it's in the Sundanese language, and it means mountain of light, or mountain of enlightenment. The site had been known since about 1914 as a megalithic site using a form of rock that is called columnar basalt. Basalt forms naturally into columns, hexagonal columns, and it makes a good building material. So it had been rearranged into this site lying on the surface of what was thought to be a natural hill. And archaeology was of the opinion that Gunung Padang was 2,500 years old or so. In other words, old, but not that old. But Danny, as a geologist, looking at that so-called natural hill, started to wonder, is this actually a natural hill? Or is this a pyramid that this thing is sitting on top of? So he went in with a team of geologists and researchers from Indonesia's Geotechnology Center, and they started to really investigate Gunung Padang. And their conclusion is that once you get under that surface layer, what you're looking at is not a natural hill, but a completely man-made pyramid. And that it's older than 9,000 years, and could be up to 20,000 years. And as Danny said in those first reports in the Australian press, it's a strong case, but not an easy one. We're up against the world's belief. So I naturally wanted to get in touch with Danny. So I was really pleased when out of the blue he got in touch with me and said, we're conducting a seminar in Java, in Bandung. Would you like to come? Because we're going to be revealing all our findings about Gunung Padang. And he also invited Professor Robert Schock from Boston University. Robert Schock is the geologist who's been instrumental in the redating of the Sphinx. And Schock and I, and Santa and Schock's partner Katie, went over to Bandung last December, and we had an amazing visit there. So there is the Gunung Padang pyramid. That's the parking level. And that's where the known archaeological site is. And there we are climbing up to Gunung Padang. There's Schock, there's Danny Hillman, and there's Nicky. And at the top, Danny unveils the results of his remote sensing, which are really quite incredible. They have used a whole range of techniques to examine this site very thoroughly over the last couple of years. That's what the site looks like on the surface. Something very interesting right underneath this slope. Columnar basalt, megalithic site. But what the new findings show is that that site at the top, as Danny intuited, is only the beginning of the story, and that all of this is man-made. It's 100 meters high, and that underneath it is stuff that's incredibly ancient. So there's the original little bit of carbon dating that was done just at this shallow depth, 2,500 years old, and that was the end of the investigation as far as mainstream archaeology was concerned. Well, Danny's taken it a whole lot further than that with his team. Even at the level of the naked eye, you can see that this site sprawls down the side of the mountain. And what they've done using remote surface sensing, surface geology, archaeology, geomagnetic survey, ground penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, seismic tomography, drill core sampling, petrology, carbon dating, etc. Thorough investigation of Grahamn. And they have found that the man-made elements go very deep into that pyramid. And this is just to give you an example of the thoroughness of the work that they have done and the whole range of scientific techniques that they have brought to bear on Grahamn to come to the conclusions that they have come to get a detailed picture of the internal structure of that pyramid and to get dates up using drill cores. I'll just run through these pictures quickly. There's one of the drill cores, and we start seeing some interesting dates, but they get even more interesting on the second drill core. There's that 2,500, then we get 9,880 years before the present. We get a date of 28,310 years ago. 21,000 years ago, another one from 11,600 BC, 13,600 years ago. All of this associated with man-made material that are brought up in the drill cores. Very, very intriguing. And then we start looking at the inside of the structure. And we find that there's what they call a very high resistivity body right underneath that slope that I showed you earlier. And it homes in, and there's something in there which is very resistant, and that they read as a hollow chamber which sends back the signals. They're suggesting that it's a modified lava tunnel. The remote sensing shows it to be extremely regular in form. Interestingly, there's a modified lava tunnel under the pyramid of the sun at Teotihuacan. There appears to be a modified lava tunnel turned into a chamber in the heart of this pyramid. And they've tracked where the entrance to it is. Large chamber, and it appears not to be the only one. They've detected not only that large chamber but two other chambers as well. So it's very interesting to consider what's going on here. That place near Bandung was part of the highland of what was once a gigantic Ice Age continent. And somebody, going back 20,000 years to the last glacial maximum, was creating a structure there and has created within it what appear to be 3 artificial chambers. And what happens after 20,000 years ago? This was a well-watered continent that was above water. What happens after 20,000 years ago is that it gets submerged. And the bulk of the submergence occurs 11,600 years ago or so. There are multiple other megalithic sites around Grahamn. The whole area is redolent of mystery and intrigue. In fact, after we finish in Australia, Santa and I are going back to Indonesia, and we're going to do a 2-week trip around Indonesia with Danny Hillman. going to visit many, many other megalithic sites on Sulawesi, on Flores, on Sumatra, and back on Java, revisiting Gunung Padang. Now, the interesting thing is that archaeology in Indonesia, archaeologists in Indonesia, are pretty much the same as archaeologists everywhere else. They don't like new ideas. They got really annoyed by Danny Hillman. They said, how dare you suggest that this monument is older than we say it is? We say it's 2,500 years old. There is no need, because the next step is excavation. There is no need for any excavation, and Danny Hillman was stopped work by a lobby of archaeologists in Indonesia. They stopped him dead in his tracks. He didn't accept that. He went to the president of Indonesia, and he brought him to Gunung Padang in December, and he showed him the results of the research. And the president of Indonesia was enormously impressed. And he said, never you mind what the archaeologists say, you go ahead and excavate this site. So that is what's going to be happening over the next year. Now, let's look at this area again. There's enlarged Indonesia, there's enlarged Australia. I'm pleased to say I'm going to be doing some research in Australia as well during this trip. I've never done research in this country before, but I'm looking forward to learning a lot while I'm here. I'm showing you this map not because of anything to do with Yap, actually. It's just what I found on Google Images. What I actually want to draw attention to is Ponape in Micronesia. Again, we're in the same broad area of the world. What do we find on Ponape? Lo and behold, is structures built with columnar basalt, exactly like Gunung Padang. There's Gunung Padang and there's Nan Madol on Ponape. Thought to be only about 1,000 years old in the case of mainstream archaeological view of Nan Madol. But its resemblance to Gunung Padang is stunning. And here's the interesting thing, I'm just making some comparisons of the two sites, is that Nan Madol is perched at the edge of the sea, and when you go diving off Nan Madol, as we have done, you find that the ruins continue underwater for a long way. They continue more than 120 feet underwater, and you find yourself confronting giant columns sticking up out of the seabed. And in some cases, these columns have fallen. This one is particularly interesting because of its resemblance to columns on the island of Tinian, which again is in that same general area. And it's raising the question because maybe these megalithic sites have been misunderstood. Maybe these megalithic sites are much older than we think, because this certainly is older. At 120 feet beneath the sea, it's been underwater for more than 12,000 years. And Tinian, of course, was the island from which the atomic bomb was launched. The bomber took off to bomb Japan. Japan is very nearby. So bear with me as I run through quickly the whole story of Yonaguni, where Santha and I put in more than 200 dives. This is the site that is generally dismissed as a totally natural site, and we're convinced that it's a man-made megalithic site. Here is a curved roadway between two walls, and when you swim east of there, you find yourself coming to a megalithic tunnel. And when you enter that tunnel, you find that it is indeed built of gigantic blocks built on top of one another. And when you get to the edge of the tunnel, you see directly ahead of you two huge megalithic blocks pushed into the side of what is undoubtedly a natural rocky outcrop. This natural rocky outcrop here. But these two megalithic blocks are really interesting. The conventional geological view is that they somehow fell into position there from a cliff above. There isn't a cliff right above that. And it beats me how they could have fallen into position like that. But I do accept that this is natural, but then so is the body of the Sphinx natural. But with natural things, you can start carving them and cutting them. And that's why it's interesting that you find these terraces round on the other side of that of that natural outcrop. If you swing around here, you come to the terraces, the famous terraces of Yonaguni. And I'm sorry, I don't care what has been said about this. This is, to me, it's obviously a man-made site. It's very annoying that it's a man-made site because it's more than 12,000 years ago and there's not supposed to have been any culture in Japan then. But nevertheless, I don't think nature did this. And if nature did it, if this was the selective removing of soft layers, leaving hard layers in place, then I want to see all the rubble that the sea removed dumped down here randomly below this platform where there's a deep drop-off. But what you get at the bottom of the drop-off is this long, clear path with a gutter at the side of it, and with all the rubble gathered nicely to one side. I think it's very easy to consider this as a freak of nature when you dive there once or twice. But if you dive there 200 times and really explore it, the man-made characteristics begin to come through. There's a huge face underwater at Yonaguni. I'm just showing this Olmec head for comparison. A huge face with eyes, a nose, a mouth, looking perfectly due south. It's on a gigantic scale. It's a rather spooky and eerie place to dive. And again, these Olmec heads have headdresses. Well, so does that feature underwater. It has a very clear remains of a headdress on the top of the head. And the head itself is nicely separated off from the bedrock at the back. A bit much to ask of nature, I would suggest. And as you pull back, you find it sits in a flat patio. And again, there are gutters running down the side of this roadway. There are stone circles above water in Japan, sometimes made of small river stones like this, and sometimes made of much larger megalithic stones. And interestingly, off the island of Okinawa, a bit further north from Yonaguni. Yonaguni is down here in Taiwan, but off the island of Okinawa, at a depth of 110 feet underwater, those exact same features are found. Except there, they have to be more than 12,000 years old. That's that small circle of river stones which appear to be cemented to the seabed. And here, a gigantic stone circle cut out of solid bedrock. This is not built or assembled, this is cut into the bedrock. And there's just no way that I can think of that nature could have done this. It has to be the work of human beings. The way the outer curve matches the inner, the curve of the central megalith. This is definitely a man-made stone circle. It's 110 feet underwater. It's more than 12,000 years ago, and we don't know what culture created it. Now let's look at the broader area. Let's go again to Indonesia. There's amazing Borobudur, which dates to about the 800s AD. And there's Borobudur at dawn, just rising out of the mists. Very, very beautiful, beautiful sight. We get a bit closer, and closer still, you begin to get a sense of the gigantic scale of Borobudur, a sort of pyramid in its own right. But what's interesting about Borobudur is the numbers. Remember I asked you to remember some numbers at the beginning. The number 72. There's 72 stupas around the central dome. And I'm not claiming that Borobudur is older. What I'm suggesting is that it encodes and encapsulates much older knowledge. And each of the 72 stupas contains a Buddha statue. And altogether, there's 504 Buddha statues, of which 432 are on the square terraces and 72 in the stupas are on the concentric terraces at the top. I've been going on about this for years, but there's a relationship of longitude connecting a number of ancient sites all around the world. I'm showing a few of them here. And Ponape, that site in Micronesia, is on that longitudinal grid. And those numbers all relate to the number 72. And what I want to do is to take us to Angkor in Cambodia, where there are 72 major temples. to Angkor Wat, which, by the way, Angkor means in the ancient Egyptian language, life with Horus. That, of course, is a coincidence. Angkor was built about 1,000 years ago, but my suggestion is that it's the latest incarnation of a much earlier series of temples, and archaeology is beginning to bear this out, that there are deeply buried structures beneath Angkor, that the site has been sacred for a much longer time than the latest version that we see there. At any rate, we have a pyramidal structure here, and it's perfectly oriented to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And here's what happens if you place yourself on this causeway and look due east at dawn on the spring equinox, on the 21st of March in the northern hemisphere. And you see the sun peep up around the side of the central tower and gradually roll up the central tower until finally it sits exactly on top of the central tower. And you realize that this is the moment that Angkor Wat was built for, to marry sky and ground on that special day. And then you find, and I got into a lot of trouble with archaeologists about this too, that the temples of Angkor appear to be laid out in a very specific pattern when you take the major temples. And that pattern greatly resembles the constellation of Draco in the northern hemisphere, in the northern heavens. And indeed, it also involves other stars that are around the constellation of Draco, all mirrored on the ground, as above, so below, at Angkor in Cambodia. And lo and behold, once we use computers to wind back the ancient skies and take account of the precession of the equinoxes, which I'll come on to in a moment, we find that the moment that that correlation is perfect is not in 1150 AD, when the latest Angkor temple was built, but in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago. So it's interesting to jump 72 degrees of longitude west of Angkor to Giza. So you don't notice it on modern maps because these days we draw our prime meridian through Greenwich for recent historical reasons. But the moment you arbitrarily set your prime meridian at 0 at Giza, you immediately notice these relationships. That the relationship is denominated in multiples and divisions of the number 72. And Angkor and Giza are exactly 72 degrees of longitude apart. And there is Giza, the Giza Plateau, the three great pyramids, the village of Nazlet al-Saman, the great Sphinx looking due east from the edge of the Giza Plateau. Looking over the Nile Valley here, again, the great Sphinx is part of this giant diagram on the ground, which I suggested earlier on is a copy of the Duat on the sky. We look at the northern faces of the Great Pyramids where their true entrances are. You see half a course of masonry on the top of the Great Pyramid here. And if you're lucky, you can see me up there as well. I've been fortunate enough to climb the Great Pyramid 5 times. It's an amazing place to be. It is a magic carpet above Cairo. It's an incredible privilege to be up there. And to see all this wonder unfolding around you. Shall I tell the story of my grandfather? Oh, I've told it too many times. Okay, so I found this graffiti down there. There's lots of graffiti up there. And I found this graffiti one step down, and it said, P. Hancock, 5th of April, 1916. And my granddad was Philip Hancock, and he was a preacher with British forces in Cairo in the First World War. So when I got down from the pyramid, I rang my dad, who had my grandfather's diary, and I said, would you check out Grandpa's diary for the 5th of April, 1916? and he said, okay, and he kept it in his drawer at that time, got it out of the drawer, and leafed through the diary, I hear it turning the pages, and then he says to me, okay, I've got the 5th of April, 1916, there's just one line here. I said, what does it say? He said, climbed Great Pyramid today. Directly below me, some 200 feet down into the body of the pyramid, is the King's Chamber, a very spiritual place which are used for meditation ceremonies today. I suggested that it's connected to the Hall of Ma'at, or the Judgment Hall of Osiris. King's Chamber is also very mathematical. You can derive the number 216 from the King's Chamber with this 3-4-5 triangle inside the King's Chamber. And that number is not random. Something else of interest. The Great Pyramid stands on latitude 30 degrees north. That's not a random latitude, that's 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. The Great Pyramids play with the sun. This is what you see on the winter solstice. There's a connection between earth and sky going on at the Great Pyramids all the time. The Great Pyramid is aligned to within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north. It's an incredibly precise piece of work. And something else even more important, the Great Pyramid is a scale model of a hemisphere of the Earth. And it's a scale model on the scale of 1 to 43,200. In other words, if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid accurately and multiply it by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And Egyptologists are aware of this, and they say that it's a total coincidence. Of course, nobody knew that the Earth was even a planet, never mind that it had these dimensions thousands and thousands of years ago. It must be an accident that this is so. And one might buy that if it were not for the fact that this number and the system of numbers to which it relates is found all over the world. It was found back there in Borobudur, and is found in mythology all over the world, and is very, very specific. You know, if it was 58,700, I might feel differently, but 1 to 43,200, that's 2,160 times 20, and 2,160 is itself 72 times 30, and 72 is the number of degrees between Angkor and Giza. And this, according to a tremendous study done by Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend, Giorgio de Santillana was professor of history of science at MIT, is proof that the ancients were aware of the phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, which is a wobble on the axis of the Earth that changes the positions of the stars as observed from the Earth, and does so at a very regular rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And 72 times 600 gives you that pyramid-Earth ratio of 43,200. And it affects the pole star, and it also affects the zodiacal constellations as they rise behind the sun on the equinox, again unfolding at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 2,160 years will see the sun transit through an entire house of the zodiac. The age of Pisces began somewhat around 2,000 years ago, and it's coming to an end now, and we are indeed entering the dawning of the age of Aquarius. That's the precession of the equinoxes unfolding at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years, 30 degrees in 2,160 years, with the great year 25,920 years in length. So it's really weird that the moon has got a diameter of 2,160 miles, and that the sun's diameter divided by the Earth's diameter gives you 108. That's 72 plus 36 is 108. It's really odd. I'm not saying that aliens did it. I'm not saying anything, actually. I'm just saying it's odd that these measurements are there, that these measurements that turn up in the precession of the equinoxes turn up in miles in the main bodies of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. And certainly turn up in myths. 72 is the heartbeat of the precessional cycle, and it's found all over ancient mythology. Osiris captured by Set and his 72 assistants. 10,800 is the number of stanzas in the Ring Vedas. You can add zeros. 10,800 is 108. 72 plus 36. 432,000. 43,200. These numbers are in myths all around the world, and Santillana and von Deschend made a very strong case that they're all encoding an ancient knowledge of precession. The Sphinx is part of the picture. If you get up on the Sphinx's back, which of course is illegal, at any other time of year, you get up there in the summer solstice, the sun's rising way over here. Get up there, the winter solstice, 21st of December in the northern hemisphere, the sun is rising way over here. But you get up there on the spring equinox and you see what the Sphinx is all about. That's when the sun is rising directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is like the Temple of Angkor. It's an equinoctial mark. It's drawing attention, drawing together sky and ground at that time. And the rising point of the sun will never change from due east on the equinox. What changes is the background constellations. And that's why it's really interesting that this diagram, this grand sky-ground diagram that brings the duat down to the earth, doesn't do so in 2500 BC when these things are supposed to have been built. It's a perfect model of the sky in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago. Could that be Zep Tepi, the first time of the ancient Egyptians? Why am I showing you a picture of the Hoover Dam? You may well ask. Because the Hoover Dam has a star map built into its architecture. And that was built there because Oscar Hansen, who was responsible for the star map, was concerned that 10,000 years from now, people might not know when the Hoover Dam was built. So the way to do that, you don't want to write a message in English, because English might not be spoken in 10,000 years' time, and anyway the message might not survive on some kind of document. What you want to do is create a gigantic piece of architecture which freezes the skies above the dam at the time of the dam's completion. And that will tell you that, as he said, that he believed in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. Now, in a sense, I mean, who gives a damn when the Hoover Dam was built? My point is that the use of large-scale architecture and astronomy to spell out a date in a universal language is something that we do. And there's no reason why the ancient Egyptians or whoever built the pyramids should have done it. Certainly, the ancient Egyptians believed that their civilization had remotely ancient origins. That's what Pharaoh Seti I is showing his young son Ramesses II here. A list of all the pharaohs who ruled before them. That list is used by Egyptologists to draw up their chronology of ancient Egypt. But they conveniently ignore the larger part of the list. They're very happy with the list from 3000 BC down to the end of Egyptian civilization, but they are not happy with the list before 3000 BC, because Egyptologists know that ancient Egyptian civilization never went back before 3000 BC. But the Egyptians appear to have had a different idea, because they said that there were pharaohs ruling for thousands of years before the first dynasty, actually more than 30,000 years before the first dynasty. They trace the origins of their civilization back. And right behind that Temple of Seti I is this gigantic megalithic structure called the Osirion, dedicated to the god Osiris, 50 feet underground, excavated at the beginning of the modern age. I don't believe it belongs to the period of the Temple of Seti I, nor do I believe that these gigantic blocks on the Giza Plateau belong to the period of 2500 BC. I think they're much, much older than that. And this is just to illustrate that it's damn difficult to move big blocks of stone. I mean, you know, we have problems doing it. And this stuff was done at least 4,500 years ago. I believe much longer ago than that. This one is also interesting. It's pointed out to me today that actually you can't really say how big this block is, because we don't know how far away those camels are. Well, take my word from it, they're standing very near the edge of that block. And actually that block is about as high as a man on a camel. This is the paving stones around the second pyramid of Giza, just gigantic megalithic architecture. The latest theory was that you know, they moved those blocks by making wet sand. Did anybody see that? It was all over the internet recently. Wet sand, and all the archaeological lobby jumps on this. The mystery of the pyramids is explained. They used wet sand, they wet the sand, and they drew the blocks across the sand. Oh, fine. But how did they get the blocks 300 feet in the air? That's what I mean. Blocks of stone that weigh 70 tons each, like these blocks in the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Certainly not with wet sand. There's the Sphinx. There's those megalithic temples in front of the Sphinx. My suggestion, Robert Schoch's suggestion, Don Anthony West's suggestion, Robert Moval's suggestion, what we're all suggesting is that these monuments are much, much older, that they date back indeed to that time of 10,500 BC, or perhaps even earlier. And it's John Anthony West and Robert Schoch's work on the Sphinx, on the erosion pattern of the Sphinx, that makes that really a very strong case. It was, however, a case, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story, I won't go into it here, but this is precipitation-induced weathering caused by heavy rainfall. It was a case that was rejected universally by Egyptologists in the early 1990s. They said, look, there's no way that the Sphinx could be 12,000 plus years old. That was the last time that you had rain of that kind that could have caused this weathering of the body of the Sphinx. It mustn't be rain. The Sphinx couldn't be 12,500 years old because there was no civilization in Egypt then, and anyway, there was no civilization anywhere else in the world either. If you had a culture that could build a Sphinx, you're going to find other ancient monuments more than 12,000 years old, and there are none. Therefore, case closed. Go away, you annoying alternative historians, and don't come back. Well, a couple of things. This is the Cleopatra's palace off Alexandria. It's not old, it was caused by a landslip. But we met an Egyptian technical diver who used to work with the Egyptian Navy, Ashraf Bashai, and he took us out to this site of gigantic megalithic blocks, more than 100 feet underwater, about 5 kilometers from shore off Alexandria. And those are certainly incredibly ancient. This site is swarmed over by archaeologists. This one is completely ignored. And here's the clincher, and it's called Göbekli Tepe, and it's just not that far from the Great Sphinx. And this is why they're going to have to eat their words, because Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. And the German Archaeological Institute say so. See, that's the difference. Klaus Schmidt, who I'm talking to here, is a mainstream archaeologist, but he's an honest one. And what he has found at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is unmistakably a gigantic megalithic site that is 12,000 and more years old. It's a story that's discovery is interesting. Back in the 1950s, some American archaeologists were over that area where there's this kind of pot-bellied hill. That's what Göbekli Tepe means. And sticking out of it were bits of very finely cut blocks. And they took a quick peek at those, and they thought, those are very fine, they must be Byzantine. We're not interested in the Byzantine period, so we want them. Much later, post-1995, Klaus Schmidt went back there, and he did that. And he excavated the pot-bellied hill, which turned out to be an entirely man-made hill. And under it, he found these gigantic stone circles with huge T-shaped pillars. How does he know that it's 12,000 years old? How can he be sure of that? He can be sure of it because whoever mysterious culture made Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried it 10,000 years ago, like a time capsule. They used it for 2,000 years, and then they filled it in. That's all man-made infill. And they closed it down, and they covered it up. And since then, for 10,000 years, until 1996, 1997, when Klaus Schmidt began his excavation, nobody touched Göbekli Tepe. It's a time capsule. It's pristine. It's absolutely clear. Other megalithic sites have been wandered over by cultures from all kinds of periods of history, but not Göbekli Tepe. And the carbon datings from it are absolutely secure. You can't date stone, but you can date organic material associated with stone. And this site is 12,000 years old. And it includes, this block was left in the quarry because it was found to have a fault, but this block would have weighed more than 50 tons had it been erected. Huge work of organization involving teams of people working together over a long period of time. This is supposed to be a time of hunter-gatherers. It blows the minds of archaeologists that hunter-gatherers could have got together to create a structure on this scale. This is the kind of thing you find 5,000 or 6,000 years later at places like Stonehenge in England. And what Klaus Schmidt is showing me here, the reason he's pointing at the ground, is because his ground-penetrating radar has shown that the stone circles they've so far excavated are like 1/20th, possibly even 1/50th of what remains under the ground. That the site is just gigantic, and they don't know yet what they're going to find. At the moment, they're running out of money. They may stop the excavation, which would be a crime in my view. They need to know what is going on at Göbekli Tepe, because So far, what they found is that the best stuff is the oldest. It's absolutely best 12,000 years ago, and by 10,000 years ago, it's not so good. And then they close it down. It seems to dissipate. It's as though somebody came in from outside with this knowledge, with this skill, and taught the local people how to make megalithic sites. And weirdly, that's exactly the time and exactly the same area that the so-called origins of agriculture begin. This is a center of innovation. They're doing this gigantic megalithic architecture, and they are also domesticating plants. And it all happens at the same area at the same time. Is this an innovation of hunter-gatherers, or are we looking at the work of the survivors of the lost civilization, connected to that mysterious period called the Younger Dryas? Because this begins to unfold really at the end of the Younger Dryas. I think it's going to raise question marks over the dating of megalithic sites all over the world. Malta's megalithic temples look incredibly like Göbekli Tepe. Maybe the date that's given to them of 5,000 or 6,000 years old at the most is wrong. Maybe that's to do with intrusive carbon from later times, because they weren't buried as time capsules. What about the megaliths of Menorca? They're stunningly like the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe as well. Maybe they're not just 3,000 or 4,000 years old. Maybe they're 12,000 years old too. Quick look at this map, the Piri Reis map. Interested in it because of this island where we see a row of megaliths running up the middle of the island. That island doesn't exist today. It did exist off the coast of North America, because here's West Africa, here's South America. It did exist off the coast of North America during the last ice age. And it's exactly where the Bimini Road is found underwater today. Continue west, let's go to Paracas, which is on the grid. Close to the Nazca lines, we find the amazing candelabra of the Andes. This is an area where there's no rainfall, and these structures carved into the desert just last forever. That one, by the way, represents the constellation of Orion. There's pyramids at Nazca. Let's go up. I'm again having to hurry because we're running out of time. Let's go up inland from there to Lake Titicaca. And let's look at the work of the Incas. This was the island of the moon. This was the residence of the future brides of the Inca, the chief honcho. This is where you'd expect to find the best Inca work. And this is undoubtedly Inca work. Is this Inca work as well? Because that's what the archaeologists say. The archaeologists say that everything you find up there in the Andes was built by the Incas. But Sacsayhuaman, I would suggest, is a site that was inherited by the Incas. Again, these massive blocks of stone, our difficulty of moving them today. There is no historical record of the Incas ever moving these blocks of stone into place. There's one record of them trying to do so, and dismally failing to do so. You find a number of different styles of architecture coexisting in the same area. The paradigm requires them all to be the work of the Incas. Maybe it's not the case. Maybe this apparent rock-hewn architecture belongs to a different period from the large megalithic blocks. And in some places, you can see 2 or 3 different styles coexisting together in the same place. Beautiful rock-hewn structure here, rather rough stonework behind it. On the streets of Cuzco itself, was this wall really the work of the same people who built this wall? Shouldn't the architectural style itself suggest to us the possibility that we're looking at the work of different cultures? That the Incas may have inhabited a much older site, may have made use of it. Again, the different periods of architecture, never mind the Coca-Cola. These guys are pretty keen to have that Coke, I can see. But you know, a huge megalithic cornerstone, beautiful architectural work here, and this rough stone, all supposed to be the work of the same Inca culture. Pisac, this rock-hewn Intihuatana in Pisac, surrounded and overbuilt with rather fine megalithic work and some rougher work around it as well. I was privileged to spend some time with Jesus Gamarra, a local man, descendant of the Incas. He and his father before him have been studying the monuments of the Andes between them for 100 years. And they have concluded that the Incas built very little of those monuments. That the monuments are the work of an elder culture. Jesus is convinced that these rock-hewn structures weren't actually hewn out of rock, that they had a method of softening the rock and impressing the patterns into it. And that then afterwards came along a culture that built in gigantic megalithic stones, and then much later, in much more recent times, the Incas inhabited the same sites and built their rather inferior architecture over the top. Here's Tiwanaku up in the Altiplano in Bolivia. I mean, look at that. Just a massive, massive block of stone, 14,000 feet above sea level. Interestingly, the H-shaped blocks at Tiwanaku, because the H motif, of course I'm not saying they used our alphabet, but the H motif appears at Göbekli Tepe as well. And interesting to look at these hands crossed in front of the belly here, from Göbekli Tepe, and here at Tiwanaku, and here the so-called Urfa man found near Göbekli Tepe. These pillars are anthropomorphic. They have human hands and arms at Göbekli Tepe. This fellow, by the way, what he's holding, not ray guns, as ancient aliens would have you believe, snuff trays for DMT. Manuel Torres has absolutely proved this. This site is not far from the Amazon jungle. And snuff trays of this type are still used for yopo snuffs in the Amazon to this day. Cotimbo, these huge towers, not, we believe, the work of the Incas. Certain animal figures carved on those towers. I'd like to just draw some comparisons between this figure from Göbekli Tepe, this figure here in Cotimbo, this figure from Nazca. Cotimbo, Göbekli Tepe, Göbekli Tepe. Cotimbo, Göbekli Tepe. Curious similarities in iconography. This salamander from Cotimbo, the same salamander at Göbekli Tepe. Serpent at Cotimbo, serpent at Göbekli Tepe. And this one, in the Temple of the Moon near Cusco, rock-hewn serpent. If it is a serpent, it's got this very large head. It looks almost like a newt or a sperm, perhaps. And at Göbekli Tepe, that same large head and sinuous body is found on one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. At Göbekli Tepe, we see this figure emerging from the pillar with the hands in front like that. Exactly the same device found at Cotimbo in the high Andes. The hands in front of the belly here at Tiwanaku. The serpent we remember on the side, the serpent on the side of that column at Tiwanaku. Let's finally jump over to Easter Island, which is not quite on the grid today. It's about 70 miles off it. But during the last ice age, when Easter Island was part of a gigantic archipelago, it was absolutely on that grid. Is it possible that the Easter Island statues are much older than the 700 or 800 years that archaeology attributes to them? Is it possible that a later culture came along and re-erected these statues on much inferior platforms? If you look at this platform, you'll see that an ancient Easter Island head is actually built into the platform, which tells us that the platform is from a different time than the heads themselves. And these ones, sticking up out of the quarry in Ranararaku in Easter Island, you might imagine that they just go, a few feet down into the earth, but they don't. Tor Heyerdahl, who I had the privilege of knowing and meeting several times, that's Tor here in the blue safari suit, excavated these statues in the 1950s, and he discovered that they go 30 feet under the ground. And this is where Robert Schock, my friend, the geologist who did the work on the Sphinx and who I traveled to Gunung Padang with, has done some very interesting work and made a very important observation. This is sedimentation that has covered this statue. What Schock is saying is there is no way on Earth that you get 30 feet of sedimentation in 700 years. This statue must be much, much older, thousands of years older than it is thought to be. It's got little hands joined in front of its belly. Here, and again you can see the hands joined in front of the belly on the Göbekli Tepe figures. More clearly here. There's the hands joined in front of the belly of the Israel figure. There's the hands joined in front of the belly in exactly the same way on the Göbekli Tepe pillars. And these are bearded figures, these Easter Island figures. Those aren't just monstrous great chins. Those are definitely beards that they are wearing there. And it's interesting that there's a bearded man up in Tiwanaku as well. I promise I'm getting near the end of the talk. Really near the end. The Viracocha figures in Tiwanaku. And up on this pillar, we've turned it sideways here. It's on the side of the bearded, mustachioed face of Viracocha, is this weird-looking creature, which looks astonishingly like Toxodon to me. And Toxodon went extinct in the Andes more than 12,000 years ago. Then there's the bearded figure of Quetzalcoatl and the traditions and myths of the bearded civilizer who comes in the time of darkness in Mexico. And I showed these photographs earlier, clearly not of Native Americans. And then there's the bearded figures of Mesopotamia. Oannes with the fish on his head and his cute little man bag. Little man bag here. Here's another of those nice little man bags. What did they have in the man bag? Was it their stash? Why are they all carrying man bags? We already know why he's wearing a fish on his head, but what is the man bag? And why is this Quetzalcoatl figure, why has he got the same man bag in Central America? Supposedly from a totally different time. It looks like iconography, it looks like a symbol that is being recognized here in different cultures around the world, especially when we go back to Göbekli Tepe and we find the same man bags there on top of one of the columns. And we find this interesting bird figure, a humanoid bird figure with some object in front of it here, exactly the same as this Sumerian humanoid bird figure holding a pine cone with, again, the man bag. Are these perhaps the symbols of the survivors of the lost civilization that we're looking at here? Is it not a coincidence? Is it possible that all this iconography connects because it all goes back to the same source? And this is, I promise, 5 minutes, we're done. A huge effort seems to have been made to use astronomy and architecture to draw our attention to the period between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. Is it possible that something of great significance for the world happened in that period? Something that led to the destruction of a great global civilization, as many myths maintain. Something on the scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic astroarchitectural projects around the globe to mark and commemorate it. And it turns out that something did, because we now know what caused the Younger Dryas. And we now know exactly when it happened. It was 12,980 years ago, give or take 5 years. It was precisely in that window that is indicated by the archaeoastronomy all around the world. The Earth was hit by the fragments of the giant comet. Those fragments impacted quite a number of places around the Earth, but the principal impacts were in North America. They hit the North American ice cap. Everybody remembers Shoemaker-Levy 9 hitting Jupiter in 1994. That was a comet that fragmented. And believe me, if Shoemaker-Levy 9 had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. No life on Earth at all. The Earth would be sterilized. Which is the moment I like to say thank you, Jupiter. Thank you for being there. Thank you for protecting us. This giant guardian swinging around in the outer solar system with its huge, immense gravity drawing in most of the comets that would hit the Earth. But some get through. And that's what happened. It's been an argument initially. The evidence started coming in 2007, and it's been coming in steadily ever since. There was a while when scientists rejected it, but now the evidence from the Greenland ice cores is absolutely overwhelming. There was a gigantic comet impact with the Earth 12,980 years ago. It caused an episode of dramatic flooding. Then it threw up a huge dust cloud into the upper atmosphere. That dust cloud shut off the sun's rays for more than 1,000 years and plunged the Earth into the deep freeze that is called the Younger Dryas, that ended 11,600 years ago. And it's not just prehistoric humans who were wiped out by it. I think that we're looking at the smoking gun here. I think this is the episode that brought an end to that great lost civilization of myth and tradition that is memorialized all around the world in such documents as the Dresden Codex, in Maya frescoes. Sometimes the myths speak of a deep freeze. Very specifically, exactly are describing the Younger Dryas and how sanctuaries were built under the ground to protect people from those freezing climates. And that brings us back to this period. That is the smoking gun, that episode, 12,980 to 11,600 years ago. Our whole story comes after that. It's what happened before that is the realm of mystery and the realm of intrigue. They call this the black marble. It's the Earth at night, photographed from NASA satellites. It's really amazing. It's incredibly beautiful. It's normally taken to indicate the areas of development in the world, the areas that can afford electric power, the areas that are thriving economically today. And the dark areas, they're the areas that are poor, that haven't yet been able to afford electrification, that have no electric lights to light them up at night. But here's the interesting thing. If the same thing happened to the Earth today that happened 12,980 years ago, the only people who really make it through are the ones who live in the dark areas. Because they're the ones who know how to live off the land, who aren't dependent on technology, who have an organic relationship with the Earth. What we're so proud of in our arrogance today may be exactly our undoing, that we are over-dependent on technology, that we don't know how to survive anymore. I think it's time that we learned the lessons of history and didn't take the security of our civilization for granted. The history of the Earth shows that events can occur which change everything overnight, and that we too, like the citizens of Atlantis, may be forced to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. Thank you.